What I'd like to do now is just to open the questions. I have one or two questions myself, but I'd then obviously like to hear from the audience. And looking around the audience, I see we have a number of therapists here with many years clinical experience as well, and we very much welcome your participation in our discussion. Can I just first ask the following question, which I know troubles a number of us in the Jewish community. The question is as follows: is suicide a new phenomenon amongst Jewish communities worldwide? What signs should we be concerned about, and how should we respond to them? There have been instances, Rabbi Yoni referred to it as a teacher having had a pupil that's committed suicide, and certainly I'm sure many of us will know in our communities where this has happened, and the after effect, not just for the family, but for the wider social circle and community. So if I could ask perhaps members of our panel to contribute and answer on this point. Thank you. Would you like to?
Suicide is a massive problem today. In fact, worldwide, suicide rates are actually coming down amongst adults. Israel is one of the lower incidents of suicide around the world. But when we look at the teenagers, it's doubling. And in America, the same thing. In America, it's even more of a problem. And I mentioned some of the issues with social media, and people feel alienated and disconnected. But I think when it comes to the teenagers, we're seeing an increase by fourfold. And in the 10 to 14-year-olds, a massive increase. And we don't really know how to approach that. But some of it is part of what Rabbi Weinreb has spoken about the disconnect between parents and the children today, and the children are being more connected to the friends and then feeling alienated from values and from the educational influences. The question is how to deal with it, and it's not such a simple issue.
Yes, and suicide rates amongst the young are definitely going up. I think, as I mentioned, that social media has an awful lot to answer for. I think also, my husband has a saying that if you send 3 messages, it's on like a WhatsApp or text or whatever, it's a conversation. And we're not having conversations anymore. We're doing all these things electronically and on remote, predictive text. Wrong messages get sent. What's so terrible about actually picking up the phone and talking to someone? And the concept of Shabbat as well. We had the Shabbat UK, people who didn't celebrate Shabbat at all, to say switch off and tune in, I think was the saying. It's actually really lovely to sit down and have a meal together where the phone isn't going off all the time or buzzing, or they're not looking at something. And I would love to see more of that and have that revisited. We need those human connections, like you were saying about our brain function, and I was talking about postnatal depression. You can actually monitor babies' brains, and they can look at 2 circles, a triangle and a semicircle. If you put them in a different order, there'll be no brain reaction. If you put them in the order of a face, suddenly they're firing off. We need these things to survive. We need these things for our mental health, and I would encourage everyone to do more and more of that.
If I could just add one quick thing. We talk about prevention for dental problems and traffic safety for children, but what about teaching children prevention for mental health issues? And Rabbi Weinberg touched on it a bit today, and we've been doing that in various communities, and Rabbi Weinberg and I went to Hasmonim school today, and we spoke to the children about that. Some of the kids to say, you guys are very intelligent, but who's ever spoken to you about mental illness prevention or mental health? And there's certain ways that you can engender this with children. You can start talking to them about these issues from very young, from grade 1 until grade 13. It can be done.
I think I focus more clinically. We obviously see a lot of people, particularly within addiction services, because suicide is often associated with things like alcoholism. And the message always is, in the first instance, if somebody talks about suicide, always take it seriously. Do not brush it off. There is, amongst some of my non-psychiatric colleagues in A&E, They may see somebody who's coming after taking an overdose and say, oh, well, it's only a cry for help. To which my answer would be, well, if it's a cry for help, why aren't you helping? It is not it's not something you should ignore. Obviously, if you are not experienced in handling such situations, get help. At its most simple, you can always, either you or the person who's threatening suicide can always phone the Samaritans, so you've got an ear there the whole time. You can contact your GP, you can go to A&E, and the psychiatric services will support you. One of the tips that I find most helpful in actually handling situations is having established how serious the suicidal intent is, because if somebody is on the top of a building and they're about to jump, and unfortunately we have had this, we're in the centre of Luton and we actually have a building opposite where 2 or 3 people have actually jumped off in the last year. So it's very real for us and my colleagues. When you're in that situation, obviously it's about talking somebody down. But if they aren't at the situation where they've gone to the top of a building or they've taken some action to harm themselves, it's about talking with them, letting them vent any concerns they have. And the prime thing I find most helpful is helping people to see a future. One tip that I use, it doesn't work in all situations, but it just illustrates the simplicity. One of the things I will do, which I can do, and you'll have different situations, is it may be Thursday, so I'll give somebody an appointment for next Tuesday. What you're doing by that is you're saying, actually, you do have a future. And if you have a future, you're less likely to kill yourself. So make sure that if somebody talks to you that they're thinking of killing themselves, take it seriously. Do not feel it is all on you, because there are other people around, and hopefully that will make the situation much more manageable.
Yes, any questions for the floor? Anyone wants to comment that from their own clinical experience? Yes. Thank you for the question. Maybe I can broaden it a little bit. You know, if your children are under the age of 18, then you as parents can be responsible for them. But if you have issues of where there are psychiatric problems, then you see the kids that are struggling, but they are adults. They're going to be treated differently by the health services, and parents and other people could be standing by, feeling somewhat helpless as to what can we do. We can't, as this lady said, make them take medication, and we just see that the problem's escalating. Well, what can one do under these circumstances? What would you recommend?
So compliance is a big issue. So 1% of the population have schizophrenia. So in Israel, if we have 8 million people, it means we have 80,000 people with schizophrenia. So with the range of expression of the illness. But not everyone is in a hospital. In fact, we only have 3,000 beds. So the vast majority of people with the illness do not need to be in hospital and can be managed as an outpatient. The issue is most of them don't necessarily see that they have an illness or agree to medication. But that means it requires an incredible amount of effort on the part of the staff to invest in the treatment of these individuals. When we know that the earlier you get involved in treating illnesses, or illnesses, particularly the neurodevelopmental ones like schizophrenia and autism, you can change the whole trajectory of the illness. But that means that it demands a lot from the staff, and you can't always succeed. But that means that you have to really work hard for it. And I remember when I graduated from medical school, my Rav was at the graduation, and I said, "Why are you doing in the graduation?" He said, "Because he's waiting for one of his students to become a doctor to tell him something that he's been wanting to say for a long time." And what did he tell me? he said to me, and it became something that became very important for me, and I think it relates to your question. My Rav said to me, I want you as a doctor to invest in your patient as much as you can, as if there's no God. And to do everything you can for that patient as if there's no God. God does not exist. But at the end, to accept the result as if there's no you. Which means that I need to put an incredible amount of effort in to say, okay, what do I need to do as a medical professional to invest whatever I can and give whatever I can to that patient. But at the end of the day, accept that I can't really change everything that I can do that I want for that patient, because people have rights. And I have to respect the autonomy of the patient, even though that I think I might know something that's best for him. But those rights for a patient are something that I'll stand for, whether it means that they refuse treatment. And at the other end, when I say I'm going to stand up for their rights in the other areas. For example, I'm very controversial in something when it comes to marriage of people with severe mental illness like schizophrenia. I strongly believe that people with severe mental illness also have rights to get married and to have children. Whereas many in the world today say, no, the person has mental illness, they shouldn't get married and shouldn't bring children into the world. And I think they do have rights. And I think people do have. That means that it requires and demands a lot of input from the community and from families to help them, and sometimes even to take care of those children. But still, people with severe mental illness have rights, for the good or for the bad. But it's the autonomy that I will always respect. At the end of the day, I have to respect the autonomy of patients. By the way, the International Medical Oath for Doctors 3 years ago changed, and they added 3 new things, which didn't exist in the International Medical Oath. And what are the 3 things? One is autonomy. One is that doctors need to look after themselves to help others. That's why I think that all doctors should run full marathons at least once every 6 months. And the third thing is that a doctor has an ethical duty to share the knowledge with the community and to reach out and to say, I'm not going to just look after my knowledge and treat the patient in front of me. I'm actually going to share that with the community and to help them. So for example, at my Sure, if we have 13,000 births, we're going to get a lot of postpartum depression. So we need to reach out to the community to discuss this with rabbis and teachers and community leaders and the mothers themselves to say when there's depression, when the issues, when to reach out and to when to get help. And people are thirsting for that kind of knowledge, and doctors never always used to do that. Now we have an ethical duty, and that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight, sharing some of the little knowledge that we have with you, because it's important for us to do that. So, for example, a few months ago when we opened up to postpartum to women after delivery and to say, okay, we want to talk about postpartum conditions. Everyone talks about depression, but there's also anxiety and PTSD and OCD and psychosis, etc. And we opened up in a room like this for 100 ladies, and 600 arrived. We had to move across the road to a community center. People are thirsting for knowledge, and a doctor has an ethical duty to share our knowledge with the community.
It's a horrible situation to be in, absolutely horrible situation to be in. I'd liken it, and it's not only mental illness, it's all illnesses. People don't take their medication, a doctor desperate for them to take their medication, and they don't comply. So it's not just mental. Yeah, probably higher. I mean, certainly the project I've been doing recently, people over 75, if they're on more than 4 medications, they're not taking them. So if you put them in a Dosset box, that helps. But it's a bit like the situation with a man not giving a get. There is always a way to get them to do it. And it's how clever you are and your experience as a doctor at trying to flip the situation. Perhaps as a GP, when I've known people for a long time, I've got that much more power to be able to do that. And I can usually get someone to comply if it's something as serious as schizophrenia. You might want to think about what's called depot injections, which are long-acting, because part of the problem with schizophrenia is they lose insight. They don't think they're sick. But if you can at least get the first depot injection in and they start to improve, then it lasts for 4 weeks, you get the next injection in, and then they get into a pattern, and then they get more stable. And rather than getting them to take a tablet every day, which would be very difficult to monitor. So the injection route might be a better way to go. It's just a word of advice, and maybe get a doctor who's known them for a long time, or someone they respect, a teacher, someone who is outside the family and therefore has a bit more pressure to be able to get them to comply. There's always a way around, though. Don't lose hope.
Question from that, Rachel. Professor Charles, do you want to respond to that challenge?
No, these are all very important issues, and it's not easy. And that's what I'm saying, that we have to invest incredible amounts of energy in trying to work with people to get that. You know, in Israel, autonomy is such an important value there in terms of for the good or for the bad, that if someone is suicidal and not psychotic, you can't treat them against their will. So a person has to a combination of being both psychotic and an acute danger to themselves or others. Otherwise, you can't do any treatment against the will. So in other words, if someone comes to my emergency room and says they want to jump off of the building and they're not psychotic, they're just depressed, I have to let them go and jump off the building according to the law of Israel. But as a religiously orthodox physician and someone who strongly believes in working for the good of the best interests of the patient, I can't let that happen. So I have to sit sometimes for 2-3 hours in the emergency room when I'm called to such cases and work with the patient and try and convince them. And you always can find some kind of way. And it might not necessarily be me that the person listens to, but everyone here in this room has at least one person in their lives that they will always listen to. And you need to find that one person sometimes that one person is going to listen to. And it requires a lot of effort. But at the end of the day, coercion doesn't necessarily work. Maybe to work in the short term. In the hospital where I work at now, in the psychiatry, we have no coercion. I'm not against coercion, but it doesn't have to be 70% like in most psychiatry hospitals, because it's much easier for the doctors if I can coerce. I can just give treatment without the patient's agreement, and then I can just force treatment. It's much easier for me. When I'm working with a patient, when it's completely voluntary, I have to work much harder sometimes for the patient to agree to the treatment. But it's worth it at the end of the day, because I don't want to be in the control business. I want to be in the treatment business. So I will never ever restrain a patient, but I will work very, very hard on making sure they have good conditions when they're in hospital, so they will agree to treatment because they have that connection with me.
Let me move on to another question. A question I'd just like to pose to our panel is that we've seen it both in the Jewish community and the wider community an increasing incidence of eating disorders. Whether our panel have any observations to why that should be happening, and what could we do to minimize this particular problem?
We have a true expert on eating disorders here, and it's not me. I have my own eating disorder. I can only say this from the little that I know and have observed, and etc. I remember there was a time early in my career as a psychologist that I had various halachic questions in my professional capacity. And I would address them to a Rav in Baltimore then. He since long passed away. His name was Rabbi Sternhill. And I asked him, he asked me, well, tell me some of the things that you do and some of the kinds of patients that you see. And obviously he realized immediately that of all the various diagnoses in DSM that one can think of, many of them, if not most of them, are not, halachically speaking, pikuach nefesh. Some are. Obviously, depression, suicidal depression, certainly, as pikuach nefesh, life is at risk. But we also were talking then about eating disorders, and of course, there too, this is pikuach nefesh. He advised me that I was not allowed to, but that I was compelled to do various things, including violating Shabbos, etc., in order to assist people with eating disorders. But there's a concept that was certainly popular in the days that I was in practice and keeping up with the literature, which is a function of mental health, not only of mental illness, and that is body image. How do we think of our bodies? Do we think of ourselves as attractive? Do we think of ourselves as repulsive to others, etc.? And that's really a core part of our identity, not only who we are as people, but who we are as a body. As a body, it has a lot to do with sexuality, but in every respect, what do we think about our body? What I've seen in the eating disorders practices of colleagues of mine or friends of mine or people who consult me in various ways, it's in the Orthodox community, mainly because of the cultural conflicts that all of our younger people are open to, are exposed to, whether they like it or not, whether we want them to be or not, is a tremendous cultural conflicts within the Orthodox community about body image. Because on one hand we're supposed to have tzniut, on the other hand the beauty is not important, and yet there's mixed messages that they receive from the outside culture, which are multiplied greatly nowadays with social media, etc. And there's this tremendous pressure to somehow be beautiful and exactly have the right kind of body. I think a lot of those conflicts are which are increasing in the culture, are part of why we're seeing so many more eating disorders than usual, and why eating disorders, to me, and certainly Dr. Strauss can correct me, seems to be very much related to cultural issues. There are cultures in which one does not see eating disorders at all in adolescent girls, and there are cultures where it's very prevalent. So that's kind of a tip-off that there's something happening in the world culture that's feeding into, excuse the expression, feeding into the prevalence of, increasing prevalence of eating disorders.
So it's a fascinating issue, and we don't have obviously time to talk about it. We had an evening dedicated just to eating disorders. I mean, the classic study by Anne Becker when she went into Western Fiji just before the introduction of TV, Western TV, with all the body image issues, and she investigated eating disorders before and 3 years later after introduction. And there was a massive change in the incidence of eating disorders and body self-image, etc., etc. So that's on the one hand. But then if you look at the Orthodox population, it actually can be very different. In Israel today, it appears that eating disorders is much more common amongst ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox girls than in the secular girls. And the question is, why is that? So and that is, for example, the reason why we had this massive need to open an eating disorders unit, because these young girls were not getting treated because their parents were keeping them at home, because if they would go be treated in other institutions, secular institutions, part of the treatment is to get rid of your culture from where you're coming back and challenge the done thing, and they would get treated and survive, but they would leave Yiddishkeit. So the question is, why is it so common in this population? And one of the reasons, the obvious thing, is to say, oh, shidduchim, because everything's self-image and how you look on paper. But that's probably not the truth. And it's probably only a very small part of it. And probably the main issue is an issue of control. If I have my life is very stressful, I have issues and conflicts, etc., the area where I have most control is over my body. And that's where they're expressing it in eating disorders. And we have a massive epidemic of eating disorders relatively in the Orthodox. But then the question is, what about the boys, right? We talk about the boys. When I studied medicine 250 years ago, they told me there was 100 to 1, 100 boys to 1. Now it's about 20 to 1. But in the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox world, it's about 10 to 1. So there's still more girls, but they're relatively more boys than there used to be, and definitely in the secular population. And the boys are being thin, not because of body image, but because of asceticism, what we call in Hebrew sagfanut. They're holding back. They want to say, okay, I want to be a purer, I want to be more spiritual by holding back from the evils of the world. And part of the evils of the world today is food. And one great Godel who recently was Nifta said the 4 evils of the world today are salt, sugar, white flour, and fat. And the boys pick up on that, and therefore they hold back. So there is this cultural influence, but there are these other issues that are going around, and it's a very complex issue.
Dr. Kay.
Can I make one comment both about eating disorders and trying to get help for people who are not taking the medication? Part of the fact that the psychiatric illnesses are so devalued is the fact that certainly in this country the resources are therefore taken away. Over the last few years there's always been a very limited amount of resource in psychiatric illnesses. Even that has been reduced. And the bottom line is what that means in practice is if you don't have money, you can't employ the staff. If you don't employ the staff, there is no one to go and sit with you to try and help you to work through the fact that it would be useful to take the medication.
The only other thing I'd like to add is I think the control is quite important, and I think it's also used as a form of contraception, because if you get your body mass index down low enough, you won't have periods, and therefore you can use that as a form of contraception. And I think that's probably a factor in the religious community as well.
So in terms of resources, in Israel, about 1 person dies a day for car accidents. So it's about 360 deaths a year for car motor vehicle accidents. And massive amounts of money is invested in preventing car accidents. But there are double the number of people that we know of officially, who die from suicide. A tiny fraction of the amounts of resources that go into preventing car accidents go into preventing suicide. And you can do that. You can have suicide, anti-suicide teams, educational. But it's not being invested because, once again, the stigma against the managing mental illness, and the mentally ill don't have a voice. And we have to be that voice.
You just wanted to know that as a Rob, if a Rob would have a shaila from someone who's an anorexic and about whether they should fast on Yom Kippur, we would tell them to eat. Because if they feel they can be justified by not eating, they're not going to be able to continue with the treatment program that they're having. So these are questions that are certainly coming before Rabbanim as well at a halachic level. Can I invite a question from the floor? Yes, Graham. Thank you very much for that point. Yes, gentleman in the front.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to hear. The theme that's come up so often has been connection, and disconnection, how that impacts mental health. Government said that the opposite of addiction is connection, not abstinence, and I love that. We clearly have a problem with connection. So dealing with mental illness and saying that reduce stigma, that's definitely going to make a contribution. What other systemic changes could we be putting in place to facilitate greater connection in our communities? I remember when I was a kid, I read Ed de Bono said that post-Nietzsche, rock stadiums have become the new cathedrals, and therapists have become the new priests. And that's not good enough. You've got to have something better. Except, how do you get people to connect? And I'm asking this as much to the rabbi as to the panel, because this is a shared responsibility if this is genuinely such a pivotal part of mental health.
Sure. Rabbi Weinrib?
I shared with you the Rav Hirsch's essay, where he makes this sharp distinction between the role of the parents and the role of the school. And he makes a very sharp distinction. I don't think that it applies in the context of the schools that we have today. He wrote this now close to 150 years ago. But I think it's incumbent upon both parents and school to work separately and together to foster as many opportunities to make connections as possible. They can do this in a variety of ways with just a small dose of creativity, to encourage teamwork in sports activities, to encourage chavrusa study, all right, for parents to have friends brought over to the house, to have an open house. I mean, there's a Beischa Pasuach L'Rvocha has a certain therapeutic effect too, besides being a mitzvah. To have a house where people come, where there are guests, etc. I think in terms of a special interest in family, the role of grandparents. You know, grandparents have therapeutic needs, right? And their grandchildren can fulfill those needs, and at the same time, their grandchildren are connecting to the grandparents. There are many, many ways and things that we can do. I think we have to be explicit about it, open, to sit in a teachers conference or principals of various schools getting together to brainstorm on ways in which we can foster opportunities in a variety of fields within the academic program and in extracurricular activities to encourage friendships, occasions for friendships, and just within the religious context we can do it in all sorts of ways. Every siyum can be an opportunity for connection between the people who are doing the siyum. And you don't have to have a siyum only on Maseches Bava Basra. You're going to have a siyum on, we just finished the Til Sheni in Parshas Toldos, and have a siyum on that. And it's a party. People get together. I mean, one way is looking at connection is very interesting, but in the history, in Jewish history, there have been various movements that have been concerned about the lack of connection and that have encouraged connection. And Hasidism is explicitly, when it was begun to have an opportunity to have a connection. A tish can be a connection. One of the criticisms of contemporary Hasidic situations is that the tish is no longer a connection because it can be 3,000 people and you can't connect with 3,000 people. But the old-fashioned tishin, and some of the ones that I saw in my youth, by now well-known Hasidic Rebbes, was really only 20 people around the table, and there was interchange. It wasn't one person talking or whatever. On and on and on. There are many, many opportunities for connection. They're built into our culture, Baruch Hashem, and we can expand upon that.
Just a very quick, we went to Hasmoneum school today and we spoke to some of the children. One very intelligent teenager asked us a question that what happens if someone comes to him with a crisis? What does he do with his friend that comes with a crisis when he doesn't know what to do? And how does he respond? And what did we say? The most important thing to do in a situation like that is just to listen. And that's how you connect. And people don't know how to do that. And we need to teach people how to do that. You know, how many times do we say we come home from a difficult day and we say to a spouse or a friend or someone says, you know what a bad day I had today? And this happened to me, I got such a headache. And the person you're talking to blows it off and say, you think you had a bad day? You're not happened to me? People don't listen anymore. And that's really what connection. And it can be taught. And we need to teach them. These are skills that you start with at a young age and deal with it. And guess what? Adults need those skills as well. We all need those kind of skills. The best counselors today are actually the Rabbanim. And the Rabbanim are wonderful sometimes at counseling, but they sometimes are not taught some of the basic elements of psychotherapy counseling. And for example, something like boundaries. And boundaries can be taught. So that's something that can be taught. And we need to teach that between all of us. And adults should continue to learn things as well. But adults actually can learn things as well.
In what format would you do it?
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes it can be done in community centers. Sometimes schools should be doing it. Sometimes work situations can be done. There are many different contexts where it can be done. But it can be taught.
A final question before I invite Rabbi Tucker to give a vote.
I've been putting my hand up
Yes,
for a long
sure.
time.
Yes.
I'd like to say two things about the two speakers that are very good about watching your child and being present. And it's so important that watching and being present is when they go to SEM or yeshiva as well.
When they go to SEM and yeshiva, to be noticing what's happening to your children at that particular phase in life.
I agree with you thoroughly. Yeah, very, very important. And often in sending one's child away to school, whether at the seminary age or sometimes for high school or whatever, The parent needs to really think through whether the best thing for the child is to be away from home.
When you have a child where you have to almost read between the lines, so children don't always, they're very good at hiding things.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
It was mentioned by the two medical doctors who are not doing, well, the two medical doctors here. There's a reason for non-compliance. The medication is horrific. I haven't had any definite input from either of you guys about the nutritional side of things. We know they've proven scientifically as well that zinc is one of the deficiencies with eating disorders, for example. There are many other deficiencies. My friend who runs Compassionate Mental Health, she couldn't make it tonight. She had to come from Wales, and she posed a question because I asked her to put a question forward. And I'll read it to you. It is wonderful to hear that Maya Yeshua has a more holistic and healing approach, treating the whole person, not using restraint, etc. But how do we avoid people becoming lifelong psychiatric patients? As our culture of long-term prescribing and medication first, and as a medication first response created chronic health problems. So I feel that there's not enough physiological input. There was again mentioned about biological components, but not treated physiologically.
Okay, I think we hear the question. Would you like to make any comment?
You want to say that?
Sorry, can I respond to that? This is, again, one of the problems that we have in trying to understand psychiatric illnesses. Psychiatric illnesses have been studied over many years, and it is very clear from records of doctors who are very careful in the 19th century that illnesses like schizophrenia have really three basic courses. There are people who have a psychotic episode once, possibly twice, and never have it again. There are people who have repeated episodes. This is all from a time when we didn't have medications, and all we could do is keep people in mental hospitals. And then there are people who simply do not get better, and over years they deteriorate. So schizophrenia, for example, is a long-term illness. Now, nobody would put the question that if somebody had diabetes, we should stop their insulin because of the fact that it's a long-term illness. And we don't like it in society. We don't like to accept that things sometimes don't have a cure. We live in an age where there is fantastic things that can be done for some conditions in medicine. There are some conditions, psychiatric illnesses are only part of them. We can think of other things like rheumatoid arthritis, where these illnesses are long, continuous illnesses that may improve but may well not. And all we can say at this stage is when you have got that sort of situation, we must use the treatments we've got to their very best ability. We must optimize them, make sure that we've been very careful. But we must also strive, and this is something that is really going out of services at the moment, we must strive to find new and better treatments. There hasn't been a proper new psychiatric drug for decades. Now, coming back to their unpleasantness, all medications are going to have side effects, and there is no doubt that the medications that we have to treat illnesses like schizophrenia are extremely unpleasant. Sometimes we are not dealing with right and wrong, we're dealing with the lesser of two evils. So if we start from the point of view that we have to start bashing what limited treatments we have, we're not going to be able to help people at all. So I think it's really important for us to start from the facts. And the facts are that illnesses are illnesses and we can't wish them away. That treatments are in no way perfect, a long way from it. Let's not fantasize a pill for every ill that is going to sort everything out. It doesn't. That those working in the services, the vast majority are working for the welfare of the people they're trying to look after, and that trying to get a balance between encouraging people. In England, we still have the opportunity of forcing people to take medication against their will, medication that they don't particularly want to take. We understand that. But when you look at the damage they do to themselves as a result of their illnesses, sometimes there has to be that level of balance. It will never satisfy everybody. There will always be somebody who turns around and says, you can't do that to people. But the reality is, all we can do in an imperfect world is do the best to try and help people get the very best life they can. Nowadays, if you're treating long-term psychiatric illnesses, there is very much the concept, it's a misused word, I'm afraid, but it's the one we use, of recovery. It's saying, if you've got a serious mental illness, we will get you to the very best place we can. And then we will also try and make sure that you have a life with it. I remember vividly, in one of my training positions as a trainee psychiatrist, meeting somebody who had been put on medication for schizophrenia by my predecessor, because in the junior roles you change job every 6 months or a year. And he had responded, and he was having a life. And the thing he came into me, and this is many years ago, before we really tried to get recovery and getting people's lives back on track, or as good as they could be, this man turned to me, he said, I said, how are things? He said, do you know something? I've just been given a flat by the council. It's only a bedsit flat. As it happened, I'd visited somebody else in the same block, and it was a very standard but satisfactory and clean and properly constructed flat. And this man said, do you know something? I am so pleased with it. Our role, I'm sure the Professor and I and everyone on the panel would love to find a perfect cure for illnesses like schizophrenia, drug addiction, that mean that they're not going to happen. Unfortunately, the world is not like that. And we have to accept that and make sure that we work and focus on getting the best for people in an imperfect world.
Thank you very much. Just like to invite Rabbi Chaim Fachl to make some concluding remarks.
Good evening. I've been asked to give a vote of thanks, and of course I started with Professor Sanya, Diane Beanstalk, and Rabbi Yoni Golka. Where are you? There. Thank you so much for allowing us to use this beautiful premises, and for the moderator especially. Thank you so much. Thank you to our local committee of the British Friends of Minor Yeshua, specifically Graham Calvert and Dr. Rosalind Landau, who without their help this evening could not have taken place. Of course, our professional panelists, our local experts, Dr. Robert Cohen and Dr. Jacqueline Marshall, we have learned a lot from your expertise, and I'm sure that Professor Strauss and I will be discussing this all the way home, and how to be able to include your advice and your expertise in the work we're doing at Minor Yeshua. Our special guest from the USA and Israel, my very good friend Rabbi Dr. Hirsch Weinreb, for your beautiful discourse, and again we've learned a whole lot of new things from your speech. And finally, to my friend, and I hope he's my friend, my colleague, Professor Rael Strauss, the medical director of Minor Yeshua's Mental Health Center. We're here because of his insistence that we share our knowledge and experience to communities around the world, and the fact that we have done this now in a number of places, and that we could probably go on until the early hours of the morning, shows the importance of what we're trying to do. Finally, thanks to all of you. The very fact that you've come out on a cold and wet evening, well, this is London, and invested in this sort of program shows that what we are doing is important to the community, and we will continue to share our experience and our expertise and our know-how as much as we can. I'm not going to make an appeal for funds tonight, but my appeal is to come to visit us in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, see what we're doing, and share with everybody else you can the work that we're doing, and become our ambassadors. Thank you all, and have a very good night.